Purchasing Neo Geo games to play on original hardware is something that was always out of the question for most people. The library of games was just too costly, and there were often good, normally priced ports of the games on other consoles. Now, for the first time since the Neo Geo's release, we finally have some less expensive ways to play those original games on the hardware they were built for. Before we begin, I just want to mention one quick thing. If you're just looking to experience the full library of Neo Geo games, I suggest that you start with emulation or by playing ports of the same games that are available on different consoles. The truth is, Neo Geo console hardware is expensive, the games are unfathomably expensive sometimes, and these ROM carts are pretty pricey as well. This video is really focused on people that have already made the decision to use original hardware and just want to use ROM carts for ease of use or just to be able to try games that they were previously unable to get. Alright, that's it. Let's jump right in and check these out. There are now 3 choices of ROM carts available for Neo Geo MVS and home AES consoles, 2 from Terra Onion and 1 from Darksoft. Both cart makers have had their products on the market for over a year, and you can consider both mature products. I'll be reviewing these on an AES console with the Unibios 4.0, as that's just easiest for me, but their MVS versions perform identically. Let's take a look at each individually and see how they work as of their most recent firmwares. I'll start with the original Neo SD from Terra Onion, as it was the first to hit the market. It comes in a plain black shell with a standard MVS style box. One quirk of the Neo SD is that when it's inserted in the console, the micro SD card is blocked. Not a huge deal, but it would have been nice if you could remove it without taking out the cartridge. As you can see, it only takes about 8 seconds from power on to the menu, and boot times are something we'll be talking a lot about in this video. Also, regardless of configuration or what game was previously loaded, it always just takes the same 8 seconds to boot, give or take a second. Pressing down and up will scroll one game at a time, whereas scrolling right and left will scroll a page at a time. Also, you could sort by different filters and genres if you'd like, but to be honest, I just usually leave it alphabetical. Pressing B gets into the options, and I usually have it set to menu mode, but if you wanted, you could boot directly to a game. So essentially, after you program the game, the cartridge acts as if it was an original game cartridge. Then setting the in-game trigger is how you get back into the menu, which is of course how you would get back into the menu if you have it boot directly to the game. I usually leave it at the default of A, D, and Start, but you could change it to a few different options if you wanted to. System mode and region are grayed out on this because I already have a Unibios installed, but if I didn't, you'd be able to select whether it's in AES or MVS modes, as well as US, Europe, or Japan. Cartridge mode is similar to boot mode. However, after loading the game, if you eject the SD card, the Neo SD now becomes whatever game that you just loaded. So it'll boot instantly, and there's no way to get back into the ROM cart's menus, which is great if you want to put this in a stand-up cab or something and really lock it down to be the game that you've just programmed it with. Then once you put the SD card back in, you could just hit the in-game trigger, go back to the menu, and either get out of cartridge mode or just load a different game. MVS backup RAM save, I believe saves your scores and your data to the SD card as opposed to something like the external memory cards, which is handy for MVS consoles because most consoleized MVSs don't have it, and most stand-up arcades I found don't even have it. I always turn the UI sounds off just because I don't like any annoying clicks, but that's really up to you. So that's pretty much it for the menu. These are the settings that I usually leave them at, and it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to use. So overall, the original Neo SD functions like a standard ROM cart. Boot to a menu, select your game, wait for it to load. And load, and load. Honestly, this is my only complaint about the original Neo SD. Some games take forever to load. There's 2 things you need to know about the load times though. First, there's only loading delays from the menu to the game, and once it's loaded, it performs exactly like an original cartridge. So while yes, sometimes waiting minutes to start a game is annoying, it's not like the delay you'd get with some CD consoles where there's in-game slowdowns. Once it's loaded, it's loaded. So let's trigger the in-game menu to go back to the Neo SD screen, and I want to show another very important point. Reloading the same game is instant, and that's even after powering off the console. In fact, that game will stay in memory until another game is loaded, meaning if you're the type to play one game at a time, loading's almost a non-issue because you only have to deal with it when switching games. So that's pretty much it for the Neo SD. A basic, easy-to-use ROM cart that, depending on the game size, might have long load times. Since I showed a long load example before, I figured I'd close this section out, showing the shortest expected load times. Not too bad at all. Next are the multi-carts from Darksoft. The AES version comes in a really nice case as well as a plastic cover, while the MVS versions come in a standard MVS box. The micro SD slot is on the top, making it easy to access without removing the cartridge. The boot time for the Darksoft carts vary depending on the last game loaded and how many games were selected. The boot time I'm showing here is around 28 seconds, but there's only one game loaded. More details on this in a bit. Navigating the menu is the same as other ROM carts, and you could scroll by page or individually. Once you've found your game, you can choose between assigning it to one of 3 slots, or just hit start to boot the game directly like I'm doing here. I have my Darksoft cart set to boot directly to the game list, which is a relatively new feature added on a recent firmware. Firmware updates are definitely easier on the Darksoft carts, as it's not specific to the serial number of the cart. Just download it or get it from a friend and load it on. Alternatively, the Neo SD carts require you to register them, which is annoying but understandable as it's just a different method of security. Okay, now that we've confirmed the 22-second boot time for the same game as before, let's hit start and up at the same time to go back into the menu. Now let's check out the other way to load games. Just highlight a game and hit A, then assign it to a slot. With the Darksoft cart, you could load up to 3 games at once and switch between them instantly, exactly like you do with the stand-up MVS cab. When you're done selecting games, hit B till you're back at the main screen, then hit exit and program games. The one downside of this method is that it then loads all 3 games at once, tripling the load time. It's still usually under a minute, but not as short as just one game. I get the impression that Darksoft designed this with the arcade MVS experience in mind. Select your games and boot, then walk away and have a functioning cab. That's awesome for some scenarios, but a bit awkward for people used to the basic ROM cart experience. After the cart finished loading, it booted to the first game. As you've already seen, I was able to instantly switch to the next game by holding start plus right. Alternatively, you could hold start plus left to switch the games in the opposite direction, all without accessing a menu. To me, this feels really similar to switching cartridges on a real multi-slot MVS. Okay, now let's go back and check out the menu options. At the games list, hit C to enter the menu. The first option is the list we just came from. The second is the configuration of each game you've loaded, which are things like dip switch settings and options for each game. It's important to note that if you have a Unibios installed like I do, that will override all of these settings. So if you do have one installed, I wouldn't even mess with this page. Also, both Neo SD carts have similar dip options, but you can't even see them if it detects a Unibios installed. As an FYI, if you just hit start to load a game, it will automatically go to the first slot, and you can still change options here. Back out and you'll see system configuration, where you could select launching under AES or MVS modes, as well as region, which is handy if you don't have a Unibios. Then there's the menu configuration, which in where, at least in my opinion, there are some immediate changes to be made. I always set boot mode to the game list, but you could set it to boot to the main menu or just boot to the games, a feature that's really handy if you're using a stand-up cab, as it truly would mimic a multi-slot MVS. Next is the boot timer, which is used when you boot the cart to the menu. If there's no interaction after how many seconds are set, the cart will just boot to the games and skip the menu. I always set the game list display to list mode as opposed to thumbnails, because it just makes it way easier and faster to scroll through all the games and get to the one you're looking for. Definitely turn off the animations in order to speed up scrolling through the menu, and go ahead and turn the music off too. I loved that song when I heard it in Beverly Hills Cop, and I loved it again when Knight Rider used a ghetto-ass version of it in the 3rd season after the show started to go downhill, but I don't need to hear it every time I boot my Neo Geo. I also have it set to skip to the intro because any chance to speed things up is nice. Then I leave in-game hotkeys on, but if you're putting this in a real arcade machine, you might want to turn them off so no one accidentally switches the game or loads the menu. Hit A to save your settings, and that's about it. That's about it for major options. You could run a diagnostics or show different stats about the cart, as well as even have a help menu that reminds you of the commands to change games or go back, but overall, that's pretty much it. The Neo SD Pro AES version ships with a really nice case, and while the MVS version isn't out yet, I believe it will ship with a case as well. There's a small serial port as well as a USB port on the side of the cart next to the micro SD card. And once again, it's just too low to remove the card while the cart is plugged in. As you can see, the Neo SD Pro has the same fast boot time as the original Neo SD. Menu options are also identical, although the Pro adds the options for an in-game menu, which I'll show later. The game selection screen is where things get interesting though. Once you select a game, you can choose to just launch it to Flash or to assign it to a slot. Assigning it to a slot works similar to the DarkSoft cart, except you could select up to 4 games instead of 3. Load times are pretty long here at just under 3 minutes for the same large game we've been testing. Luckily though, once a game is loaded into a slot, it's in there until a different game is loaded in its place and doesn't need to be reloaded upon boot. Here's the Pro's boot time with all 4 slots loaded, the same exact short boot time as when no games are loaded. Also, launching a flashed game is instantaneous, so that long boot time for those 4 slots might not really matter to you. Now let's check out the Pro's in-game menu. You can go back to the Neo SD menu, enter cheats, soft reboot the game, or hard reboot the whole system. Also, you could change games right from this menu, and it's very quick. Now let's go back to the main menu and demo the RAM slot option. Any game loaded to the RAM slot will be lost after powering off, but the load times are a bit quicker. KOF is loading here at just under a minute. I guess loading to RAM is a good option if you're just going to play a game once and don't want to remove one of the games that's already programmed to a flash slot. After the RAM game is loaded, you could access the in-game menu and instantly switch between all 5. Once again, after you power off, the RAM game will be gone, but the other flash options will be there. So tons of options overall. Getting ROMs onto any of these carts is different than your average ROM cart experience, and to be honest, I would recommend doing some creative Googling and just finding pre-made ROM packs for each. I know you're not supposed to say things like that, and I certainly can't host those ROMs myself, but truthfully, it's a bit of a pain, and people have already gone through the work of making these happen, so try and hunt those down. If you're looking to load individual ROMs, I can give a little bit of insight, but I've honestly had bad luck no matter which I tried. On the DarkSoft side of things, the only games that are currently supported are official Neo Geo games, so no homebrew, which is really frustrating because the monitor test tool that I use is an essential part of the things that I use to calibrate consoles, as well as capture equipment and monitors. You could still kind of hack it in there, but I really wish it was just as straightforward as putting a folder or a zip file or something on there. As for now, I think you could hunt down individual games, and as long as the folders are the exact proper label, that would work, but I've had bad luck with that too. And on the Neo SD side of things, I believe you're able to take any ROM that you want and use their tool to convert it to a .neo format, but the very few that I've tried had issues anyway, and I just ended up hunting down the ROMs themselves. So it's a bit of a bummer for people that want to just only put on the games they like, or for people that like to rip their own games, which does still exist in the Neo Geo world, not as common as other consoles. But unfortunately, there really isn't an easy way to just run games on both. And due to the way that Neo Geo games themselves are actually made, there might not ever be a way on any console to do it that way. Don't forget that there's a lot more into a Neo Geo cartridge itself than there is your average game. So it might not ever be as easy as just a one-file dump like you'd find with Nintendo or Super Nintendo. So either way, I don't consider it a bad thing for these carts, it's just an annoyance that we all have to live with. And once again, as weird as this is to say, I think the best bet is for you to just do some creative Googling and try to find the pre-made packs that are already floating around out there. Overall, I think all three of these are great choices. To me personally, the Darksoft cart seems like something a stand-up MVS cab owner would want to buy, as it really would mimic the exact type of scenario you'd get if you were using a multi-slot MVS. The original Neo SD is the most inexpensive solution, and inexpensive being around $450. So if you're looking to try to use real hardware for as cheap as possible, that's definitely the way to go. If you want every single option packed into one cart, the Neo SD Pro Edition is the one for you. But keep in mind that it's almost $200 more than the cheapest option, just the basic Neo SD. Honestly, I think all the talk about load times has gotten a bit overhyped, but it seems to be important to some people, so let's have a quick recap. The original Neo SD could take between 30 seconds and 3.5 minutes depending on the size of the game you're loading, or more like 15 seconds if you're just reloading the last game you played. The Darksoft multis average about a minute from power on to game access. This time will vary based on how many games are loaded and the size of each game, but it won't change too much, only a few seconds each way of a minute. Lastly, the Neo SD Pro takes between 20 seconds and 3 minutes to load a game, depending on the size. But remember that boot times are always under 10 seconds, and games in the 4 RAM slots boot instantly. I don't think it's fair to call any of these carts a winner for load times, as how long you wait will really depend on how you use the cart. If you only play one game at a time, after the first time you load the game, they'll all be about the same load time. If you're constantly loading a new game each time you play, the Darksoft multis would be a little faster. So basically, throughout all three of these, you have every option covered, you have every scenario covered, and now finally Neo Geo owners could really have every game on one console without worrying about either purchasing those very expensive games, or to be honest, if you already own those games and spent all that money, I would never want to actually use them. I'd rather use a ROM cart and leave those games safe on a shelf somewhere to be displayed. Well, that's it for this time. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider signing up for any of my support platforms, as none of these videos would be possible without your help. Also, if you'd like to be kept in the loop of everything going on in the retro gaming scene, please check out the weekly podcast, as well as tons of other videos and tutorials that I have going on. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.